Hi to all the AARP volunteers who are watching this. Thanks for your ongoing advocacy and all your volunteerism. I promise I don't say this to all of our clients, but the AARP volunteers truly are the most engaged volunteers that we have. And so our lobby team oftentimes uses AARP as the example for what activism and volunteerism should look like. So I just wanted to say that before starting. I'm Eric Gerrard. I work with American Communications Group here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we are fortunate enough to lobby for AARP over at the Nebraska State Legislature. So I'm going to go through a presentation that kind of does some of the legislative basics about how many senators we have, best way to advocate to those senators, and then go through how a bill becomes a law and that sort of process. I know you're viewing this online. I think we will have opportunities to chat live, probably virtually, and we can get into more specific questions that you may have. So I'm going to hop right into the presentation. First thing that I'm guessing you all know, or for anyone who did fourth grade here in Nebraska, you probably went through this and maybe even did a Capitol tour. But the Nebraska legislature is the only unicameral system in the United States. And so that means we're the only legislature that only has one house, which is extremely unique. And that you'll see later in the presentation, that leads to some of the other sort of checks and balances that the Nebraska legislature has in place. But we're the only unicameral system in the United States. I believe that happened roughly in the mid 1930s, and it was sold on for many reasons, but primarily based, I think, on it would cost the government less money if you didn't have two houses. So we're down to one house, which there are 49 senators that we get to spend our time with. Those senators are elected on a nonpartisan basis, which also is unique in the United States. I believe we're it says right there, the only nonpartisan legislature in the United States. Oftentimes people kind of roll their eyes when you hear nonpartisan, because you see so often there are partisan issues that come up. But truly, compared to other states, there really are. There are many times I've seen Democratic senators vote with their Republican colleagues and vice versa. And then it's really important when you go to the ballot, if you aren't an extremely informed or partisan voter, you really don't know who you're voting for, what party they belong to. And I think that's important. You're voting for the best person, or maybe that person that you know best in the community. And I think throughout the legislative process, that nonpartisan sort of attitude comes through in different forms. There are certainly times where the legislature can be partisan, and there are certainly partisan senators kind of on both sides, so that I don't want to be Pollyanna and act like that never comes into play. But I think we're fortunate in Nebraska that we have that, and it fits in well with AARP and how AARP advocates to those senators. I said it before, but 49 state senators in the Nebraska legislature. And so that may seem like a high number, but again, compared to other states, that's very achievable to be able to get to know a good number of those state senators, and especially your state senator should be accessible to you. Most of the times they're pretty responsive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are approximately 25 urban districts and 25 rural districts right now in 2021 and heading into 2022. We're starting to see that change slightly. There's more of a shift to an urban population, and there is a redistricting process every 10 years that takes into account the population. The districts are supposed to be similar in population, and here in Nebraska, we just went through that process in September of 2021. And so at the start of 2022, you'll see senators with a few new constituents and kind of different makeup of their districts. But that happens every 10 years after the census. The senators themselves are paid $12,000 a year. They are technically part-time. I say technically because so many of them treat it almost like a full-time job, or put in the hours of a full-time job. But all senators have full-time staff. Most senators have two staff members, and they're full-time. Typically, one of those staff members deals with communications, helps schedule for the senator, and talks with the districts. If a constituent has an issue, usually they'll talk to that administrative aide. And then the legislative aide typically does more policy analysis, does bill drafting, and focuses on policy. But it depends on each senator and what they expect from their staff. But something to know, part-time senators, but they each have full-time staff. In Nebraska, we have short sessions and long sessions. So the 90-day or long session happens in odd years. So that just happened here in 2021, but we're heading into what's known as a short session, a 60-day session. At the start of a long session, the committee chairs are elected, and they're elected via a secret ballot. So that's one of those nonpartisan aspects. Nobody knows who's voting for who. And the thought is, if it wasn't a secret ballot, then there'd be, Republicans should just vote for Republicans, Democrats should just vote for Democrats. That doesn't happen. The best person is supposed to win the chairpersonship, and that has happened, I think, more times than it has not. Also, at the beginning of those long sessions, new committees are determined. So as a lobbyist or as advocates, we're very interested what the makeup of the committees are going to be. We truly don't know that until the first day of the long session. It's kind of interesting. We usually, there's a committee called the Committee on Committees who meets kind of all afternoon on that first day. And then we usually get a text or an email with what those committees look like. And the first text or email you get is usually kind of chicken scratch from one of the senators you're close with, who is trying to write down the names of who's on what committee. But that's that first day of a long session is very important. The committee chairs and the committees. And those committee chairs and committees will stay that way for 2 full years. So that long session and then into the short session. So in 2022, as I said, we're heading into a short session. And so we'll have the same committee chairs and the same committees to deal with. Heading into a short session, those bills from last year that weren't either passed or weren't indefinitely postponed or killed, all those bills will carry over and remain alive heading into the short session. So that's why you view the 2 sessions together. At the end of 2022, or at the end of the 60-day session, any bill that hasn't passed any bill that hasn't passed will be indefinitely postponed at the end of that year. And starting in 2023, you have to introduce brand new bills, and you're kind of starting from a clean slate, and you go through that committee chair process again. In 2022, I'm guessing by the time you're watching this, we're already past January 5th, but the session began on January 5th this year of 2022. This page is just how a bill becomes a law. I pulled this from Unicam Kids, and we're going to get into more detail, but I really think Unicam Kids does the best job of describing how a bill becomes a law, really simplifying it. And so I always like this graphic. We'll go into detail, but bill is introduced. There's a committee hearing. Committee decides whether to advance or not advance that bill. Then there's full debate in front of the entire legislature. You can see says yes, no, compromise, let's vote. If a bill passes 3 rounds of debate, heads to the governor's desk. The governor gets to decide whether to sign, veto, or whether the bill becomes law without governor's signature. Once that happens, you have a law in the state of Nebraska. So that's the most simplified version, but probably the easiest version, I think, to explain. And I think this slide does it well. Real quick, I just did want to explain, I know I said I lobby for AARP, but oftentimes I tell my friends or new acquaintances that I'm a lobbyist, and that means almost nothing. I think there are there are probably bad images sometimes that you think of with a lobbyist, and some people just don't know exactly what a lobbyist does. So here's what I at least think we do or try to do. Our main goal is probably forming a relationship with those senators, the staff that I mentioned, and then getting to know candidates who are running for the legislature. And as you'd expect, there are some you're just more, you get along better with. I have friends that I was friends with before they became senators, and so that's kind of an inherent relationship. And there are others you really, you aren't quite as aligned with, but I try as much as I can to try to find a few things maybe that we have in common, and try to talk through those things so there's some sort of understanding or some sort of relationship built there. And I would encourage all of you to do the same as much as you can get to know your senator or senators and staff. I think that's really helpful when you step into the office. It's a friendly face, and it makes the whole process a little easier and more comfortable. The other role of a lobbyist one of the other roles is to understand client needs and priorities. So for AARP, we meet often with Gina and Todd to make sure we understand exactly what AARP priorities are for a given session. And sometimes it's more important to know what their priorities aren't, because you'll have senators who say, well, I really need AARP at this hearing testifying. And if that doesn't fit in with what AARP's priorities are, sometimes our role is to tell them we can't do that, or that's not as important to our members or to our volunteers. So that's one thing that we have to do. Once we understand AARP's needs for the given session or priorities, we try to educate senators on those needs and positions. And sometimes, as you'll see below, that we'll ask senators if they'll introduce legislation on behalf of AARP and try to explain why we think that's good public policy, why they would be a good senator to introduce a bill. And then other times it's communicating to senators, say a bill's been introduced that is harmful to AARP members. We have to advocate and make sure enough senators understand why that's a bad idea. And oftentimes bills are introduced without knowing kind of the unintended consequences or the consequences. Sometimes it's very clear. The senator is just trying to maybe help his or her district or cut certain taxes, but it can be harmful to many clients, but in this case, AARP, and it's up to us to usually make sure that introducing senator, but also the other senators who will see that bill, make sure they understand our position. In 2021, just to give you a sense of how many bills are introduced, there were 684 bills introduced in 2021. In 2022, we anticipate maybe not quite that many bills to be introduced because it's a short session, but there are just a number of bills that are introduced. And so as lobbyists, and we work with Gina and Todd on this, we review all bills that are introduced, because you never know. It may seem, say there's a bill that goes to Agriculture Committee, it may not seem like it has, like AARP would have an interest, but you never know. Far down in the legislation, there could be something that pertains to members. So we try our best to review all bills that are introduced, and that's a time-consuming process, as you might guess. Real quick, I used to do this at the end of the presentation, but I want to do it now in the middle before we get into some of the details of bills and how the Nebraska Legislature works. I want to do the 10 informal rules of lobbying. So this is, for me as a lobbyist, I try to follow these, but it really is really helpful for anyone who's advocating for a position or a volunteer who's either meeting with a senator or another entity. So number one, consider yourself an information source. Sometimes the process can be intimidating, and there's this, what I think is misperception that a state senator knows more than you as a volunteer or as an advocate. I think most times that's not the case. Like I said, there's 684 bills introduced. And so there's no way as a state senator you can get to know every little detail of that bill or even memorize the bill numbers. So really, you as a AARP member, as an advocate, are an information source. So a part of that is, you should have confidence that you are an information source and view yourself that way. This may seem too obvious that it shouldn't be put on here, but tell the truth. If you don't tell the truth, if you lie, or if you even kind of mislead, senators remember that, staff certainly remember that. And it happens from time to time, believe it or not. And that's the biggest way you can really hurt yourself or your organization as an advocate, is if you aren't telling the truth. And sometimes that can be as simple as saying, I don't know. If somebody asks you a question, you just say, instead of trying to say yes or no when you don't know, saying I don't know, I'll get back to you, is a perfectly fine answer. Number three, know who's on your side. So for AARP, we want to know what other organizations are also supportive of legislation. Who are we working with? Maybe it's NACO, which is the county's association. Maybe it's the Retired Teachers Association. That's important when you're advocating to know, to say, oh, we work with a broad coalition or a good number of entities. So that's really important. Maybe more important, and number 4 is to know the opposition. You should know, and this is something that I will help Gina and Todd will all help with. So if you're advocating on something, who opposes that bill or that public policy. And not only know the opposition, but ideally know the arguments that may come up. So that's important and something we'll talk through as bills are introduced. Make your connections known. So if your neighbor is the senator's son-in-law or son or daughter, it's really, like I said earlier, it's important to make those connections known, and all of a sudden you become a very personal connection and not just somebody who's standing in the rotunda who doesn't know this senator. So any connections you have with those senators, I think it's important to make your connections known. Don't be shy about it. Sometimes it can be uncomfortable to try to make it important or make it known about those connections, but we encourage you to do that. I hit on this one earlier, admit uncertainty. If you don't know, that is a perfectly fine answer. And I think it's a really good way to follow up. I don't know, but let me check with somebody and I will get you an answer. I will email you an answer is important. Number 7, be specific. So say you're presenting on LB 220, make sure to know why it's a good bill, why it's important for AARP, but also make sure to make the ask. Don't just hand it to them and say, good luck. You want to say AARP supports this. I would ask you to support this when it hits the floor of the legislature, or ask you to oppose this. So be specific with your ask and the details that you do know. I've talked about this one already, but follow up. So again, if you don't know something or if they ask for information, that's a great way to advocate, is to follow up and say, it was great meeting with you. Here's some of the information you had asked about, and then either provide that information in an email, a call, or a letter. That's important. Number 9, don't burn bridges. This is similar to telling the truth, but you want to stay on that senator's good side as much as you can, even if you disagree with them on certain issues. So that one kind of goes without saying. And then this last one probably should go without saying, but advocate, don't agitate. I use this example many times in the past, but I've seen advocates kind of screaming at senators, and I have never seen a senator change their mind based on somebody agitating them or screaming at them. So when you're advocating, I think it's important to be respectful. You can be firm about your position, why you feel that way, but don't agitate. And to be fair, I've never seen that from an AARP volunteer, but it's something we think that is important to point out at least. So now we're going to get into more specifics of the legislative process from the Unicum Kids graphic. This is the bill introduction segment. So each senator can introduce bills. They have no limit on the amount of bills that they can introduce. Those bills have to be introduced within the first 10 days of a legislative session. And so those first 10 days are very intense for both senators and advocates. And usually at the end of the 10th day, all of us kind of take a deep breath. So at least we know what is out there, how many bills there are, and we may not know what's in each and every bill, but at least we know the number, and no more can be introduced after that 10th day. So that's always a big, an important day within the legislative session. As I said, the most common bills you see are individual senator bills. So we'll say Senator Wayne, Senator Wishart, they can introduce as many bills as they want on a variety of topics. You don't have to be on a committee to bring a bill. You can really bring a bill on anything you think is important to you, important to your district, or important to the state of Nebraska. Each committees can introduce bills. I don't believe they have a limit on the number of bills they introduce. Typically, committee bills are bills that everyone on the committee agrees on. Most commonly, they're non-controversial, kind of what are considered cleanup bills. Maybe you need dates extended, dates moved around, but usually you'll see the whole committee sign off on committee bills, and they're fairly non-controversial. State agencies, so for example, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, Department of Economic Development, they can ask senators to introduce bills on behalf of state agencies. And I put in Christmas tree bills. Oftentimes that's a number of subject areas that the department wants in one bill, and they'll ask either a senator or a chairperson to bring those bills. You also see budget bills. In the first year of the long session, you'll see that's the only constitutional obligation that the legislature has, is to pass a budget. And so you'll see budget bills. That starts the governor introduces the budget. Usually the speaker brings that bill on behalf of the governor, and then the appropriations committee gets to make tweaks to the governor's budget, put in what they think is important as a legislature, and that's how the budget process works. In a short session, there are adjustments to that budget based on whether we're in a better fiscal situation, worse fiscal situation, but usually there are minimal kind of changes in that short session. The governor can request other bills aside from just the budget, typically bigger issues. Our current governor has many times asked the chair of the Revenue Committee to introduce bills related to property tax relief and other items. When you're reviewing a bill, it will say if it's at the request of the governor, so you know that, and as you might expect, that gives it a little more weight in terms of public policy and politics, I suppose. Let's see, we've talked about this, 400 to 700 bills introduced each session. I hope I'm not jinxing ourselves and that there aren't going to be 800 or 900 this session, but typically you'll see between 400 and 700. I've referred to the committees quite a bit so far. So as you introduce a bill, it then goes to the executive board, which is also known as the referencing committee. The referencing committee will look at that bill and try to make a quick determination which committee it should go to. Usually that process is non-controversial. I'm trying to think of if there's a bill related to cities, it pretty obviously goes to urban affairs. If it's related to taxing, it should go to the Revenue Committee. But every once in a while, say there's a bill with city taxes, there can be battles. Should that go to Urban Affairs? Should that go to Revenue? And at that point, it's up to the referencing committee to sometimes make a tough decision where that bill goes. Bills are usually referenced within 2 to 3 days after they're introduced. There are 14 standing committees, and the next slide are going to show you what those committees are. Senators, if they're unhappy with where the bill was assigned, can ask for reassignment. So say you have more friends on a certain committee, or you really intended it to go to Urban Affairs, you can go to the referencing committee and ask for a bill reassignment. That's rare. Usually when they've made their decision, they've made their decision. I mentioned at the start of a long session that committee chairs are elected. Committee chairs are powerful in the fact that they control the hearings, scheduling of hearings, and they have more staff. I put there again that they're elected by a secret vote, and then that the committees are selected by the Committee on Committees. As you might expect, if there are bills that a committee chair likes more than others, the committee chair typically will put those earlier. They'll put them up for hearing earlier. That way it gives it a better shot throughout the legislative process. So that's one of the powers that a chair has. On the other end of that, if you're a committee chair and you really don't like a certain bill, you can put it on the very last day of hearing, and that makes it more difficult for a bill to get across just because there is not as much time. So the committee chairs really do have a lot of power and influence. Here on this slide, you can see the 14 standing committees. There are special committees that happen kind of on an ad hoc basis, but they aren't one of the standing committees that you see every single year. So I'll just run through these briefly. Agriculture, appropriations, banking, commerce, and insurance, business and labor, education, general affairs, government, military, and veterans affairs, health and human services, judiciary, natural resources, Nebraska retirement systems, revenue, transportation and telecommunications, and urban affairs. With AARP and with kind of the breadth of your membership and the issues that you're focused on, there really isn't a committee necessarily that we focus on. In fact, I can think of issues in almost every one of the committees I just listed that AARP has had an interest in. So it's important to know who the chairs are, and we can help with that and know each of these committees. There are probably a few that we spend more time in. I'd say revenue, and then transportation and telecommunications, health and human services, appropriations, are probably the ones that we spend the most time in, but again, kind of depends on the year and the number or the bills that are introduced. But those are the committees, and each of those committees have certain days that they have hearings, which is a good segue into public hearings. Another aspect of Nebraska that's unique is that all bills that are introduced do receive a public hearing. Sometimes we have other national clients who are surprised by that just the introduction of a bill means you receive a public hearing. So that's one unique aspect. And the people of Nebraska are considered the second house. And so for every bill to get a public hearing, essentially you're letting the public or the second house have their say as to how that bill should be received. During public testimony, so if you testify, you either have to choose whether you support the bill, whether you oppose the bill, or whether you're neutral on the bill. The neutral bill sometimes, or being neutral on a bill sometimes throws people off. Like, how do you feel so compelled to go up and testify, but at the end of the day, you're saying you're neutral on it? Typically, there are parts that you like about that bill, but there are some parts you don't like, and that's the best way to point that out to the committee. In total, I think it's a good bill, but if you would change lines 10, 11, and 12, it'd be a great bill. So that's why you go up in a neutral capacity. You'll oftentimes see state agencies also go up in a neutral capacity, just saying how this would impact their agency. I don't take a position as a state agency, but here's the practical effect of what it would look like. The public hearing process happens at the very beginning of each legislative session, both in the long and short session. It's usually the first 8 to 10 weeks of session, and those hearings are in the afternoons. And so you just have floor debate in the mornings, afternoon full of hearings. Once you're through the hearing process, then you move to full all-day debate with all 49 members of the legislature. I should put a little asterisk there because last year, I guess both 2020, when COVID first hit us, and then 2021, the public hearing process was very different to keep members of the public safe and also keep those senators safe. And so hearings were all day. That way, if somebody did need to quarantine, they could at least still watch the hearing online, participate that way. There was also new measures put in place, so you didn't have to show up and testify and be in a crowded room. That you could submit written testimony, and there was online testimony that was added to keep everyone safe. We don't know yet, but I don't anticipate 2022 will have those same sort of protocols in place. I think it'll look a little bit more normal, but things seem to be changing on a daily basis right now on COVID measures. So after you've introduced a bill, you've had a public hearing, we're going to say the committee liked our bill. And so it's up to the committee whether to advance a bill, whether to keep it within committee, or you can indefinitely postpone or kill a bill. So for this example, we're going to say the committee liked our bill, decided to advance it to the entire legislature. So there are three different stages of debate: general file, select file, and final reading. So when you hear those terms, it's really just first, second, and third readings of a bill. That's another step. You want to make sure there's 3 different times for the legislature, for the senators to hear a bill. That's another thing that I think that is because of our unicameral process, you want to make sure senators are thoughtful and they didn't make a mistake on one of the rounds of debate, or they haven't had second thoughts. So that's why there are the 3 rounds. General file is the first round. Bills can still be amended at that point. So if there's something you like about the bill but want to make it a little bit better, or maybe you have a bill that fits in well with the bill that's in front of the entire legislature, it can be amended at that point. It takes 25 votes to advance, so that's just a majority of those 49 senators. And then filibusters are becoming more common, and it takes 33 votes to overcome a filibuster. So you need 33 affirmative votes out of 49, which is a pretty sizable amount and difficult to do. And you'll see filibusters on controversial bills most typically. Select file is the second round of debate, very similar to general file. If it's a non-controversial bill, that can go a lot quicker. Sometimes you won't even see debate at all. But if it's a controversial bill, you'll see, again, thorough debate on the second round or select file. And it's the same, 25 votes to advance, 33 to overcome that filibuster. Final reading is the last round. That's you can't amend on final reading without returning it to the second round. So final reading really is made for that last chance for senators to read through the bill, make sure they think it's good legislation, and then it's 25 votes to pass. And that's if it receives the 25 votes to pass, then it's sent to the governor's desk. If the governor, so then it's at the governor's desk. The governor decides whether to sign the bill, which means bill becomes a law, whether to veto, or whether the governor can it can become law without governor's signature on ones that the governor may not be thrilled about, but is okay with. Then he just won't sign it. So if it is vetoed, the legislature has the opportunity to override a governor's veto and still make that become law. That takes 30 votes, and 30 out of 49, as you can do the math, is difficult but not impossible. So in the 2021 session, I think we saw three bills that were vetoed that were ultimately overridden by the legislature and became law at that point. I mentioned amendments. They must be germane, so they must be relevant to the bill. As an example, I'll go back to that. Say I have a bill relating to cities. At that point, I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't amend it with something related to Social Security tax. There just isn't a natural nexus between cities and, say, Social Security tax. So you must make an argument why it's relevant to the bill at hand. And amendments can be filed ahead of floor debate. So that's when you want senators to have a chance to review, and usually you think it's a good amendment at that point. Or you can surprise the senator and amend the bill right there on the floor of the legislature, either a minute or even 30 seconds before that bill comes up. So you see both of those strategies. A few more bills, and this can get complicated. So, and when we're able to meet virtually, feel free to ask questions on these. Anytime you see a bill, I think LB 220 is what I said before. So if you see LB 220A, when you're looking at the legislative website, what that means is there's an appropriations bill. So it's saying LB 220 requires some amount of state funding. And so the legislature needs to approve both the underlying topic, and then say it's $100,000 to pay for a new state employee to make sure this bill is implemented. That's the A bill, or the appropriations bill that follows it. Priority designation becomes very important. Each senator gets one priority bill, and that's usually your favorite bill or the bill that's most important to you. And with most speakers, and our current speaker Hilgers, he really tries to make sure if you prioritize a bill, if you get it out of committee, you get an opportunity to be heard on the floor of the legislature. And so that's the significance of a priority bill, is it almost guarantees that you get a chance for your bill to be debated. Each committee gets 2 priority bills, and that's usually up to the chair of the committee, although some rely on the rest of their committee members and they make joint decisions. And then the speaker of the legislature, as I mentioned, is Speaker Hilgers right now. The speaker gets 25 priority bills. So they're speaker priority bills. That's one of the powers of being a speaker, is you get 25 of those priority bills. Typically, they're a little less controversial than others. You want bills that hopefully can make it through if you're the speaker. And most often you kind of pick a diverse set of both bills and senators that you choose as speaker priority bills, because as speaker, you want to make sure everyone feels heard. You want to make sure there's some fairness in the process. And so that's why you don't just see the speaker picking his best friends or his own bills as the 25 speaker priorities. You will also see constitutional amendments introduced. And so if a constitutional amendment is introduced, as it implies, That's amending our state constitution, and that's a pretty major sort of task to undertake. If you introduce a constitutional amendment, that requires 30 votes from the legislature, and all that does is guarantee that it will be on the ballot. So any constitutional amendment has to go to the Nebraska voters. So if you pass it within the legislature at 30 votes, then it'll be on the next general election, whenever the next even year November is. You can also, you probably see people out collecting signatures. That's the other way to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot. The other thing you'll see is LR, for example, LR 432. You'll see what that means is legislative resolution. And typically those are interim studies. And you're just asking the legislature or certain committee to study certain things. And usually that sets up for legislation or for a bill the next year, is why a senator would introduce an interim study. And certain LRs or interim studies do get an interim hearing where you get to advocate and show why this should be studied and why maybe some good ideas that could come out of it. But there's no action necessarily that takes place during the interim study or interim hearing process. So I'm probably missing a few things, but that's the most kind of the quickest overview I can give of how a bill becomes a law, the legislative process, and the lobby process. As I said, we'll be together virtually at some point, I believe, end of February, early March, and we can talk in detail about the bills that have been introduced and AARP priorities. But those are, this is the overview. Feel free to come with questions, and I thank you for your time, and thank you for letting me do this for AARP. Thanks.